Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Look, we know budget meetings can be dull, but that's exactly what this year's Idaho legislative session has been all about. We break down the latest budget moves, plus all of the week's news from the State House on our Legislative Roundup newsletter. Kick off your Monday with our recap by subscribing at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters, and it's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We'll get you up to date on the news that made headlines this week. Joining us for this segment is Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun. Hi, Clark. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
And folks, before we do get into a lot of the news this week, we want to begin to acknowledge the death this week of Nampa Mayor Rick Huggabum, who died suddenly and unexpectedly during a town hall meeting in Eagle. Boise State Public Radio reporter Julie Lucetto filed this report on Thursday. Let's take a listen.
At the state legislature this morning in Boise, Senate Chaplain Doug Armstrong offered a prayer.
Well, I come to you with a broken heart. We lost a great public servant last night.
Mayor Huggabum was attending a regional town hall with other mayors and commissioners in Eagle when he collapsed. Eagle Mayor Brad Pike administered CPR before emergency services arrived on scene. The city of Nampa later confirmed Huggabum had passed. He was 47. Armstrong spoke about the mayor's deep faith. For almost a decade, Huggabum was also a pastor.
He shepherded your flock. He served your people. He led with a heart anchored in you. And now we lift up his wife, Mimi, their 5 children, and their grandchild into your hands. Be their shelter in this bewildering time.
Huggabum was sworn in as Nampa mayor in January. Prior to his election, he was on the city council, worked as Mayor Debbie Kling's chief of staff, and served as the Canyon County clerk. Julie Lucetto, Boise State Public Radio News.
The mayor's memorial service will be held Tuesday, March 31st at 5 p.m. at the Fort Idaho Center in Nampa. It will be open to the public, and our thoughts and our condolences are with the mayor's family and in all the residents of Nampa he served, along with the public officials who all knew him very well as well. We need to turn now to other news that has been making headlines this week, and that brings us to the budget battle over at the State House. The governor signed an additional budget into law for the current fiscal year, and it is not coming without some controversy. Clark, what I mean by this being controversial is that even the governor's own budget chief apparently warned against these cuts, saying they go too far. So is there any idea as to why they'll move forward with signing this instead of vetoing it?
Yeah, Gemma, that's a really great question. And you're right. The budget cuts have been one of the defining and one of the most controversial elements of the 2026 legislative session that's taken place at our state capitol in Boise and is ongoing to this day. In terms of why the governor signed it, I think there's a couple of different reasons. But basically, back in February, the governor had breakfast with the press corps and distanced himself from the budget setting process. He said he laid out a plan and a proposal to balance the state budget without additional across-the-board cuts. He submitted that to the legislature. He said he did his job and that setting the budget is the legislature's job. So he was really trying to distance himself from the budget setting process, separate himself from the additional across-the-board cuts that the legislature approved for the current 2026 year and for next year and 2027. So it was not a surprise to a lot of the reporters covering the session that he signed it into law. He's not a governor that stands up to the legislature, issuing a lot of vetoes. He has not issued any vetoes this legislative session. I believe he only issued two last legislative session, and one was just a small line item veto. So he basically said that it was the legislature's problem and responsibility, and that he wasn't going to interfere with it. But also notably, the legislature did add back in some of the programs and some of the cuts that the governor's budget chief, who you mentioned, Lori Wolf, she wrote a letter flagging some of the cuts as too deep and too dangerous and perhaps unnecessary. And so it's happening in several different stages. But after the cuts were first announced, the legislature came back through and added in some extra funding, Gemma, to boost funding for the Idaho State Tax Commission to help them process tax refunds for Idahoans in a timely manner and to comply with some of the federal tax changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that President Trump signed into law. So there was some money added back in for tax refunds. There was some money added back in after a big fight to help pay to hire some additional seasonal firefighters and do some wildfire prevention work heading into the summer. So some money was added back in for that, and some money was added back in for tuition and scholarship benefits for members of the Idaho National Guard. So some of the things that were flagged as the most severe and unnecessary cuts have been added back in, but the bulk of the cuts remain in place. And so we can kind of talk about what the cuts do, but basically Governor Little, to avoid a budget shortfall, implemented 3% cuts for almost all state agencies last summer. And when the legislature came to town this year, they added on an additional 1% cut in the current year for most, but not all, state agencies. So most state agencies are looking at a 4% cut this year. The bill that he signed into law reduces the state budget by about $131 million, and most state agencies and departments will be affected by those cuts this year and forthcoming cuts next year in 2027 as well. And so it's kind of a 1-2 punch. You're absolutely right that the governor's office was concerned about some of these additional cuts and said they went too far. Some of the things got restored, but not all of them. And I think that's why he signed it into law. Some of the things were added back in, and he had kind of set the stage that this was the legislature's role to play and he wasn't going to interfere with it. So I think some combination of those two factors plus the overall umbrella of politics are some of the reasons that explain why the governor signed into law additional cuts that he and his staff had concerns about.
Before we get to the real world consequences, Clark, I also want to talk about the fact that the bill barely passed the Senate.
Yeah.
And in fact, I want to quote the House Majority Leader because some Republicans had hesitation. Okay. So I believe I'm getting this quote right, but the House Majority Leader said, quote, "It's a crappy but necessary bill," unquote. So
you got the quote right.
What does the Okay, good. Okay, so what does this inform us about the division that's going on in the State House, in particular when it comes to having to set a budget?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of division within the Republican Party between the legislative branch and the executive branch, which is the branch that the governor leads, tension and anxiety between the legislature and the different state agencies and programs that have to not only implement the programs, but implement the budget cuts. And so I think we're at a point where many of the people in the state capitol building, regardless of what political party they're in, see a need to do something to avoid a budget shortfall. The anxiety and the tension and the chaos is coming in because there's not universal agreement on how to attack this problem, the problem being the budget. You've got Democrats who say that we should not be cutting more, that what we should be doing instead is delaying the implementation of some of the state tax cuts passed last year that reduced revenue. As well as dipping into some of the rainy day savings accounts that the state has available to stabilize the budget. So the Democrats are saying no more cuts. Let's hold off on some tax cuts and let's dip into the rainy day funds. Republicans are divided. JFAC, which is the budget committee, oversaw this process that took the governor's 3% cut and added on the 1% cut to make it 4% for most agencies in the current year and 5% in next year in 2027. Republicans are divided. Some people agree with this. Like you said, it barely had the votes to get out of the Senate. It passed the Senate by one single vote. And the margin in the House was a little bit more comfortable. I think it was more like 20 votes in the House. But Republicans have been divided, saying we know we need to cut, but we don't like the way that we're cutting. Some Republicans have said it's not a transparent process to know what's being cut or how the process played out, or how we determined what to cut and where. Versus on the other side of the Republican Party, some of the more conservative Republicans, some of the hardliners would like to cut even more. So I think we're at a point where many people in the state capitol building are saying and recognizing we do need to do something to avoid a budget shortfall, but there's widespread disagreement and anxiety and chaos over how exactly to attack the problem and avoid the budget shortfall. I think that's what we're seeing with the close vote in the Senate in particular, and the majority leader's comment about this being a crappy but necessary bill. And so I think it comes down to disagreements over the process, disagreements over how much to cut, disagreements over whether we need to stop cutting and hold off on tax cuts and dip into the rainy day funds. And so I think that's reflective of what's going on. I also feel like an observation on my end is that it's happening a little quickly for some members of the public, for some state agencies, and for some legislators, particularly legislators who are not on the budget committee that have to vote for this when it goes to the floor of the full House or the full Senate. They may not understand the process. They may have questions about it and may be reluctant to vote for cuts that they'll be held accountable for by voters when they can't fully explain the process that led to the cuts or point out to the public in a transparent fashion what's being cut, by how much, for how long, and why.
So before we go to break, Clark, let's talk about real world consequences, right? Because this is where the rubber meets the road for Idahoans. So what do these cuts mean for the average Idahoan, and what services or programs are going to be impacted, but impacted first?
Yeah, we know some of the things that are going to be impacted. Some of the things we won't know probably until after the legislative session ends and we hear feedback from members of the public and state officials who provide these services or who rely on these services. What we do know is that Medicaid mental health service programs for people with serious mental disabilities have been cut and are continuing to be cut. It's things like peer support services, services for vulnerable adults with mental disabilities. In addition to that, funding for water quality testing is being cut. I spoke with the director from the Department of Environmental Quality who told me that we're actually doing less water quality monitoring and testing than we did 20 years ago before the Great Recession, because Idaho has not climbed back from those Great Recession era cuts almost 20 years ago. A third area, Gemma, that I think the public will see the cuts is our college and university system. Some of the largest cuts are heading to the higher education system, colleges, universities, community colleges. I'm seeing cuts of more than $5 million for both Boise State University and Idaho State University, which is in turn causing Boise State University to look at consolidating some of its colleges and even eliminating a college, according to reporting that I've seen from our friends at Idaho Education News. And also health education programs and higher education. And so why is that important? Well, in January, I published a story that reported Idaho has the lowest number of medical professionals in the country on a per capita basis, and Idaho would need an additional 1,400 medical professionals added today just to catch back up to the national average, Gemma. And so one other thing that's going to be cut is health education programs and in higher education. Some of the Democrats I've talked to, like Senator Wintrow and Senator Ward Engelking, are very worried that we should be investing in some of these programs, not cutting them at this time, Gemma.
So, Clark, the House of Representatives just rejected funding for something the state is legally required to do. And this is to print and mail statewide voter pamphlets before the 2026 election. Why did this happen? I mean, do legislators understand there's a legal requirement to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and legislators do understand it's a legal requirement to do this because Representative James Petsky of Meridian stood up and told them that they're required to do this when he was urging them to pass the budget. But what happened is, you're exactly right. On Wednesday, the Idaho House of Representatives was debating a bill. It's actually House Bill 909 that would have provided an additional $350,000 in one-time money for the Idaho Secretary of State's office to pay for printing and mailing an informational voters pamphlet. And the requirement in Idaho law is that in every general election for the state of Idaho, when there is a constitutional amendment, a ballot initiative, or a referendum going up to be voted on during a general election, the Secretary of State is required to mail an informational pamphlet to every household in the state of Idaho, Gemma, basically explaining what a yes vote would mean and what a no vote would mean. It's about educating the public. And so legislators knew that because Representative Petsky told them it was required by law, but they voted it down anyways. And the final vote was 27 to 43. And I think we may not have heard the last of this one because it is required by law. And so I think next week there may be an effort to revive the funding for this proposal. But I think in terms of like, why did this die? I think that there might be a couple of different reasons. Over the overall umbrella of, hey, that's politics, would be one of the reasons. But the second reason is there was some grumbling on the House floor about whether or not the Secretary of State's office is participating in these across-the-board budget cuts that we mentioned in the first part of our show today. And so initially, the Secretary of State did not participate in the 3% budget cuts that the governor recommended, but then afterwards came back in and renegotiated a contract for like some IT hosting and is able to return about 15% of their budget to the state, which is more than the 4% and the 5% cuts. And so Petsky is saying they did it in a little bit different fashion through a contract renegotiation, but the Secretary of State is actually reducing their budget. Whereas Representative Josh Tanner, who's a Republican who co-chairs JFAC, said he was mad about the Secretary of State not participating originally, and he feels like the contract negotiation should have happened anyways. And so I think there's a little bit of politics in play. It's also worth noting that the Secretary of State, Secretary McGrain, has proposed expanding and adding to the voter's guide in 2 previous legislative sessions, and in both of those instances, the same Idaho House of Representatives declined to take it up. And so there may be some politics and some tension between some members of the Idaho House and the Idaho Secretary of State's office. It may be politics playing out in front of our very eyes, and then concern about, is everyone participating in the budget cuts and what does that look like? But I do think that because it's required by law, that we may see an effort to revive the funding next week. But Representative Petsky pointed out, if they do nothing, if they don't provide the money, it could create a situation where they're not adhering to the state law, or we need to figure out something else to happen. But yeah, you're exactly right. The hang up here is what to do about providing money for something that's legally required to help educate the voters of Idaho about an important question or questions that will be on the 2026 general election. And I think the fight is probably going to continue on this one. We're coming to the end of the legislative session within maybe a week or two, no set date to adjourn, but I think we haven't heard the last one of this because of those legal requirements in state law, Jenna.
I have only a few minutes left with you, Clark, and I really want to get to this other budget impact and this potential cut. So JFAC
Yeah.
just proposed deeper cuts for the Department of Health and Welfare. These are what, $21 million in cuts? But Clark, quickly explain to us that this is a bigger impact, right? Because they could lose federal funding too.
Yeah, that's actually right. When we talk about a lot of the health and human services programs and Medicaid in specific, a lot of that is funded primarily through the federal government, and Idaho pays a smaller share. And so you're right, by Idaho giving up the $21 million, looking at an additional $40+ million of federal funding that would be lost. Interestingly, there was a big fight less than 2 weeks ago in the Senate where one of the most experienced senators, Senator Jim Guthrie, a Republican from McCammon in eastern Idaho, said this is a defining moment that we find ourselves in as a legislature, and he challenged them to do better. And so this budget has already been killed once. You're absolutely right that they brought it back and added even more cuts. And so it remains to be seen on how the Idaho Senate in particular will respond to these additional cuts. The additional cuts didn't come from nowhere. There's an actual companion bill, House Bill 863, that's advancing this legislative session that talks about the cuts as well. Governor Brad Little also recommended additional cuts to Medicaid to balance the budget. But I think it's the biggest budget in the state of Idaho at this point. It has the funding for the Health and Welfare Department in there and for the Medicaid program specifically. So it's a high impact budget with lots of funding for lots of programs for vulnerable Idaho adults and children in some cases. And the theme of cuts and how to handle the cuts, what's the most appropriate place to cut versus concerns over long-term damage, that's playing out all legislative session long in general, and in specific, it's at the heart of this debate over what we do about the health and welfare budget and about these additional cuts, Gemma.
Okay, I have only about 1 minute left with you, Clark. So I want to ask this question.
Yeah.
I understand that where some of this cuts would come would be from reducing provider rates. How does that have a direct impact on our vulnerable citizens, like people with disabilities, et cetera?
Yeah, and so there's some concern that cutting the provider rates is going to cause some of the providers to scale back the services they offer, or perhaps even discontinue some of the services that aren't required by law. We already saw some of that with the 3% cuts that Governor Little approved last summer. They did cut back on and reduce some of peer support services is a great example of a program that was cut the first time that Medicaid provider rates are cut. And so it could affect the amount of services that are offered to vulnerable Idahoans, or in some cases, it could cause providers to discontinue the services if they're not legally required to offer them. So it could mean fewer services available, a reduction in services, cutting services that aren't legally required. And so those are some of the concerns that I've been hearing in the community in the last year. And Idaho Capital Sun reporter Kyle Fonensteel has actually done quite a bit of reporting all year about the impact of the Medicaid and Health and Human Services cuts and why it is that when we cut provider reimbursement rates, how that can actually affect the people receiving the services directly, Gemma.
Well, as always, Clark, so appreciate all the reporting you do. I recommend folks go to Idaho Capital Sun for even more in-depth information. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Idaho Matters. And for quick news of the day, start your mornings with our podcast. It's called The Connector, Idaho Daily News. And you can also listen to Boise State Public Radio podcasts, including Idaho Matters, on YouTube.